So let's get loose. Everybody get warmed up. Hum something to yourself, whatever, because we're all going to be talking here. All right, let's go ahead and get started. If you weren't here last week, this is the class on encouragers. This is also using the book, The Barnabas Factor. So if you've not gotten either the handouts or some of that information, there is some on the back table. We'll talk about that in a minute, but let's get started with a word of prayer. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for all the blessings that you've given us. Thank you for bringing us safely through the storms of the recent days. Thankful for this place that we can come together and not only enjoy the fellowship of one another, but that we can meet for the purpose of exploring your word, understanding more about how you would have us to live. We thank you for the blessing of your word, which guides us and teaches us how you would have us to be. We pray, Father, for all the classes meeting today, that you would be with everyone to open our hearts and our minds to an understanding of your word, your will, and the courage to turn away from things that don't please you and to seek the things that do. We ask, Father, that you be with us in this and everything that we do. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay. Lots of housekeeping this morning. First thing is, I am still not complete with all of the notes. So I put the next 3 lessons out on the back table to go with the first handout I gave you last week. So we're piecing it together a little at a time. And this is really what we're going to use to drive the class off, but we will be making a lot of references to the Barnabas Factor book. I think reading it is valuable, but I'm not going to go kind of page by page through it, although I may do that today because there's some really good stuff in the lesson. But generally speaking, we're going to be talking about encouragement. We're going to follow the topics from that class. So that's kind of the game plan. Second thing I will promote, just because I'm up here and I'm allowed to do this, we have relaunched our website, thebibleway.org. Joe Both has done a ton of work, just an amazing job getting that together and making that available. I encourage you to check it out. There are some flyers in the back on the visitors table, just kind of talking about, what the features are and that kind of thing. But I would encourage you to take advantage of that opportunity. One thing that's on there, and I'll just make a plug for it there too, is we have begun the opportunity to do your contribution online, as opposed to necessarily writing a check or something like that. So there's also an information handout up on the visitors table for that. If you have interest, if you have questions, I'm sure we'll be talking a lot more about this in the future, but you can see me or Joe, and we'll be happy to talk about it. So that's out of the way. One more thing. So I want to praise a couple of people who came to me last week because they did it in an encouraging way. So they were following some of the things that we are talking about in this class. But they approached me with something where I was clearly just not doing exactly what I was talking about we should all do last week. I mentioned this book. It's by a person named Aubrey Johnson, who for some reason in my mind registered as a female. In my head, I thought Aubrey was a woman. I don't know why. I don't know why I didn't just Google it. Or, as some of the wiser souls here pointed out to me, why don't you just look on the back of the book where there's a picture of Aubrey Johnson? And I'm like, yeah, that's my fault. So, Mr. Johnson, if you ever see this broadcast, my apologies. It is completely on me. But it is an object lesson for us in this class for 2 reasons. Number one, the people who approached me didn't come up to me and say, you idiot. They were very kind about it. I said, did you refer to Aubrey John? You know, they were clarifying, did you actually? And yeah. Well, you know that it's a man, right? Oh, no. Well, so anyway, really good object lesson in how to approach somebody and gently correct them. But the other thing is, as I said, last week we talked about some important tools that an encourager has to spend time listening, to spend time paying attention, to actually see the person that you are interacting with. And clearly I was not. You know, now I wasn't actually interacting with Aubrey Johnson here, but, you know, I could have been, you know, if he was in the audience sitting here last week, you know, I'd have been kind of offended if it was me. So it is important that we do a little homework, that we pay a little bit of attention to not making just assumptions about, you know, who we're interacting with or what they're telling us, things like that. And these are all things that we're going to talk about, not only today, but throughout the whole class. So, all of that in mind. This week, if you were looking at the prayer that I handed out last week and is in the beginning of this book, these are a couple of key things that you might look at this week. If you were going to kind of narrow down that prayer that summarizes the whole book, and you were to say, what kind of things should I pray about this week that will help me kind of nail in the lesson that we're going to talk about the mind of an encourager? These are some of those things, right? That it is overcoming fears. And it is using my mind to encouraging others by focusing on solutions rather than complaining or assigning blame. You know, and I will magnify you through my ministry of encouragement. Those are the kinds of things that you can be praying about as you try to think about, how do I use my mind? How do I, first of all, develop a good mindset in myself as an encourager? But second of all, how can I use my mind to encourage others? How can I be thinking through things that I want to bring forward? Now, this is lesson 5 in the book. It's the one lesson that I pulled forward to week 2. It is out of order from the standpoint of trying to read the book through. And we'll talk about why that is in a second, but I want to kind of have you do a self-check this morning. The last thing we talked about last week was there's going to be homework. And the homework last week was encourage somebody that is a relative, but is not your spouse or children. And so I'm not going to look for a show of hands. I don't know if somebody has a breakthrough experience that they want to share. If they do, I'm happy to hear it, but just kind of a checkpoint, did you do that last week? Did you encourage somebody other than your spouse or children, and did you do it with intention? Because I'll give you a sneak peek, there's more homework this week. So we're going to talk about who we're going to encourage every week, and we're going to try to make sure that we're taking it out there. So anybody have thoughts or comments from last week? Fair enough. All right, so I pulled this lesson forward. And I said we can't wait till week 5 because it's too important. So why do you think that the mind of an encourager, that our mental outlook, our approach to things is so important that I didn't want to wait 4 more weeks to talk about it for this class? Beg your pardon? Charlie says that's where it begins, and he's right, and we're going to look at some verses about that this morning, right? But everything kind of starts with getting your mind right. What else? So, let me ask it really specifically. For this class, and what we're going to do for the next 11 weeks, why is it important that we talk about the mind first? Obviously, I have an answer in mind, but feel free to toss something out. Yeah.
It's not right, it's not going to happen.
Yeah, Carolyn says if your mind's not right, it's not going to happen. And that's really the answer, right? We have to decide, what are we going to do? And what is this Bible class going to be like for the next 11 weeks? Is this Bible class going to be an exercise in Doug's talking to us, we're going to look at some verses, and we're going to say, those are some really good thoughts. I really should do better. I should be a better encourager. That's good stuff. And then we'll get 11 weeks into it, and then we'll move on to the next Bible class, and we'll be like, okay, that book goes up on the shelf. What do we got next? Is that what we're going to do, or are we going to do something else? Yes, ma'am.
It's best to come from a positive place, and being positive yourself. You can't be an encourager if you're a bummer.
Yeah. Bobby says you can't be an encourager if you're a bummer. It's best to come from a positive place, and she's absolutely right. Okay.
A little bit of what it reminded me you referred to is this is not about a checklist. And it's not about just listing off things that we need to do. It's about our whole attitude and being. And if you're not in that mindset, then it doesn't matter what you check off your list.
Yep.
It's not getting you where you need to be.
Yeah. Our sister said it's not a checklist, right? It's not about just checking off things in the box. If we're not into it, if we're not doing it from the right heart and the right mind, the right attitude, it's not going to matter. Yes, sir.
There may be a lot of things we cannot do. There may be a lot of things we cannot give someone who's in need. We may not have money. But one thing we can always give is encouragement.
Yep. David said, there's some things we can't do. Not all of us can give people money. Not all of us can do, other things. He said, but we can all be encouragers. Many years ago, I preached a sermon that I put together for a place I was going to, and it was talked about 7 things everybody can do. And from the person who is homebound, bedridden, to, the youngest, most active Christian here, and encouragement was one of them. Because even if you are homebound and in your bed, you can pray for someone to be uplifted. You can reach out spiritually in your interactions with the Lord. And to David's point, it costs us nothing. Charlie made that point last week. It costs us nothing to be positive and encouraging. Yes, ma'am.
I think it's sometimes a struggle to stop thinking about yourself. You have to really stop that habit about thinking about me. You have to pay attention around you, what they're thinking and feeling, what's going on, and get away from yourself.
Yeah, Bobby says it's hard to get away from yourself, to stop that internal focus and look out to people. And that is 100% true. And that is what everybody in the world deals with, right? Everybody's thinking about them. Even we are thinking about us, right? But what sets us apart, what changes our universe a little bit, and the way that we are perceived and the way that we interact with people, is thinking about other people. It sets us apart. I think about the text messages that have been going out for about 2 weeks now, right? Pray and go, pray and go, pray and go, right? We got friends and family coming up in 2 weeks, 13th. I guess next week. Yeah, next Sunday. My dates are a mess, but point being, right? Even if we did it like a checklist, if we took those texts that everybody's getting as a checklist, right? Okay, I threw up a quick prayer about that. That's good. That's good. That's helpful. Did you take it the next step and actually do the do? Did you reach out to somebody? Did you try to bring somebody with you? Did you grab some of the flyers and pass them out, right? That's kind of the same thing about the rest of this class, right? We're either going to decide that this is just I come here on Sunday morning, I'll be here at 10:15, or at 9:15, and we're going to do a Bible class, and whatever's talked about, we'll talk about, and, or we're going to say, you know what, I'm serious. We're going to do something. I'm going to take the stuff that's in here, I'm going to take the stuff that we talk about in class, and I'm going to do it. And then next week when we talk about another tool, or we talk about discouragement, or we talk about, how I can reach out to a coworker or something like that, I'm going to try it. And, if you do that every week for the next 11 weeks, you'll be different by the end. You'll be different. If you just kind of let it wash over you and just say, well, it's what I do at 9:15 on Sunday, you may not be. Maybe you'll get residual benefit, right? I do want to point out something. In the very back of each chapter, there is a page that is in gray, and it's kind of a little self-check that you can do every week. It's exactly the same page. It's in the back of every chapter every week in this class. And it's called Living Like Barnabas. And it's kind of a little self-check. It's got some things. Something that encouraged me last week was, you can fill it in. Someone I encouraged last week was, and here's your chance to kind of say, hey, I did my homework, right? To be more encouraging this week, I plan to, and fill that in. And then it starts saying, hey, I was more or less discouraging in the following areas, right? I was more insensitive or less insensitive. Was I critical, sarcastic, and negative? And it kind of goes through here and it lets you rate your mind and your actions and things like that. So this is kind of the supplemental checklist, right? This is the checklist that Kay was talking about, right? I can look at this and say, check, 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 check. I did all these things. But if I'm doing it to fill in the boxes, that's not really helpful. But this is a really good self-assessment to say, this week I fell short. And like we talked about last week, that's going to happen. And cut yourself a little slack. Okay? We're not going to get it right every time. We're not going to get it right every week. We're not going to get it right with every interaction we have. But we're going to try. And that's kind of takes us right into this idea of why is the mind so important? Because we can have the best intentions even and say, yes, I'm going to do this. And if we let the first time we fail kind of blow us out of the water and put us on the sidelines, then, we're not going to be able to pick it up. And it's going to become a problem for a while until we overcome it. So you got to be willing to try and cut yourself some slack and say, what about this failure can I learn from? Right? Last week I told you the Aubrey Johnson story, right? What did I learn from that? Look on the back of the book for a picture, right? That's the quick answer. The longer term issue is don't be so quick to make assumptions about people and try to get better, all right? So that's what we're really shooting for here. And that's why not only is the mind of an encourager important, that you're going to be the kind of person that finds a benefit even in failure. Not just as an encourager, but for this class, that I'm going to get better. Thoughts, questions, more comments? I thought somebody in the back had a thought earlier and I missed it. No? Okay. So let's talk about the verses that were in the chapter this week that we were looking for, right? These are all about the idea that our spiritual battle is not physical. We are not soldiers in a physical army with physical weapons, and we are not fighting a physical battle. Now, sometimes we might be, but generally speaking, it's a battle in the mind. And so, one of the first things that we get here is Proverbs 17:22, And Solomon says, a merry heart does good like medicine, but a broken spirit dries the bones. And that's the first of the verses that we come across this week where it talks about your mental state and the connection to your physical state. That there is a difference in how you think and what that manifests itself in you physically. We have countless examples of people who refuse to let setbacks, physical, illnesses or whatever. I am not going to let this beat me. I am going to fight it. I am going to overcome it, and they do. You have other people who they get bad news and they just kind of go, well, it's all over, right? There is a connection between, our outlook and our physical appearance and health. David talks about this all the time when he talks, when he talks in there about, when I was silent, it ate at my bones, but when I confessed my sin, it freed me up. It cut me loose, right? It freed me not only spiritually, but physically, and it let me move past that. So Solomon is just giving us basically the nutshell version of that mentally we are, our outlook has an effect on us in every aspect of our life. Then we get into Mark, and this is what I want to look at. So let's turn to Mark chapter 7, verse 14. Right? This is Jesus actually talking about eating with hands that aren't washed, right? This is not where you would expect this lesson to appear from. But Jesus takes the whole idea of what you eat making you unclean, and he turns it into a whole lesson about attitude, mental preparedness, and kind of what we allow into our head as opposed to into our mouth. So in beginning of verse 14, he says, hear me everyone and understand, there is nothing that enters a man from outside that can defile him. But the things which come out of him, those are the things that defile a man. If anyone has ears to hear, let him hear. When he had entered a house away from the crowd, his disciples asked him concerning the parable. He said, are you thus without understanding also? Do you not perceive that whatever enters a man from outside cannot defile him, because it does not enter his heart, but his stomach, and is eliminated, thus purifying all foods? And he said, what comes out of a man, that defiles a man. From within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lewdness, an evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these things come from within and defile a man. What Jesus is saying is you are what you think. He's saying what you let into your heart, which we would understand to be what you let into your mind, is what defiles us. What you concentrate on is what defiles us. There's so many, there's a lot of time spent in the chapter about this, but this is just a fundamental truth, right? What you spend time thinking about changes you. It changes you. And that's why so much of the scripture is concerned with what we do spend time thinking about and what we should avoid thinking about. So foundationally, what Jesus is saying is, there is a thing of being, unclean because you ate the wrong food. But ultimately, you just ate the wrong food. He's much more worried that they were not concerned about the bigger issue of what's in your mind, what's in your heart, and trying to preserve that. So Paul in Philippians 4:8, this is a really familiar verse to us. It becomes one of those things that we just kind of blow past. But in Philippians 4:8, Paul tells us the things that we're supposed to think about, right? And so in verse 8, he says, whatever things are true, noble, just, pure, lovely, good report, if there's any virtue, anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. Don't just mentally assent to them, but spend time thinking about them, because those are the things that you want to put into your heart. Good, pure, just, lovely. And not the things that Jesus said that come out of a man that defile us. Well, your heart gets messed up and you start thinking about, adulteries, thefts, murders, and whatever, because that's what you spend your time thinking about. So we get the contrast of teaching about what should go into our minds. And then 2 Corinthians, which is the other one, 2 Corinthians 10, verse 3 through 5. I got to spend more time in 2 Corinthians. There's a lot of stuff in there, and I just, for some reason don't get to that book that much. But 2 Corinthians, 10, I'm looking at verse 3. That's not, or chapter 3, that's not going to help me. 10:3 says, "For though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds, casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ, and being ready to punish all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled." So Paul says this is not a physical battle, which is kind of what we started the discussion with, right? But he says our job is to fight the spiritual battle. And our goal, the bar that he sets, is to bring every thought into captivity, right? Don't let any impure thoughts be coming into your head. Not, 10%, 20%, that's okay. He says capture every thought, right? So, kind of taking a look at all of that stuff, what does that say about your level of preparation for the things that will come into your head? And my level, for that matter. Can I just sit down, flip on the TV, and let it just all wash over me? Probably not, right, Charlie?
I just think it's saying garbage in, garbage out.
Right, it is. It's garbage in, garbage out.
Your mind, again, that's what you're going to concentrate on. That's what's going to really run your life. And the more we let garbage come in, the more garbage comes out eventually. It's a slow process most of the time. But again, it's the same thing with companionships and who we hang around with and who we talk to. It just I guess, incorporates everything that we say to do.
Yeah, Charlie said, it all comes, if it's garbage in, it's garbage out. It will affect you eventually from all walks of your life. I think it was the last ladies' class. They talked about thought garden, right? That was the thing, right? We're going to talk about thought gardens and cultivating the right kind of thoughts. And that's kind of what gets talked about in this chapter as well, right? This idea that, you don't get a beautiful garden by accident. Joe.
I don't know where you're going with that, but I can usually add on to that with my comments. Like every day we have intentional choices that we have to make. Those choices have to align with God's values and God's principles. Whether it's what we watch, the music we listen to, the things we read, the things we occupy our time with, all of those need to be intentional choices we make that align with God's values and His principles.
Yeah, Joe said every day we make choices and about everything in our life, and they have to be intentional choices about being for God and the things that God wants. And that's exactly where I'm going with this, right? This idea that you don't get a beautiful garden by accident, right? I know, I've tried, right? I've tried to put plants out and just let them go for the summer, and it's just a nightmare, right? It's a mess. Right? You can't do it that way. You have to cultivate the good things that you put out, and you have to eradicate the things that show up, the weeds, right? You have to intentionally, deliberately do that. And our mind is no different. We have to intentionally, spit it all the way out, deliberately choose what are we going to allow into our heads. And we have to deliberately choose what we're going to filter out. Yes?
It reminds me of the children's song, "Be careful little eyes what you see,
Yeah, Kathy said it's like the children's song, right, from VBS, right? Be careful, little eyes, what you hear. Be careful, or eyes, what you see. Be careful, little ears, what you hear, right? That's exactly right. And she made an important point, which is once you let the garbage in, it's really hard to get the garbage out, right? It's much easier to not let it in because once it's there, it spreads, it stays. David.
It's what we feed our minds. There's a story told of a man who went around the countryside. He had dogs he fought that fight each other. And he always bet on the winning dog. And they said, how is it you always bet on the winner? It's this one this week and this one that week. He said, I bet on the dog I fed that week. So starved one, fed one. He knew who was going to win. And that principle is true with what if we feed ourselves, God's going to win. If we don't, the devil's going to win.
Yeah, David makes the point about, what we feed is what stays, what wins, right? The thoughts that we feed, he gave the dog fighting example, but the idea in general is what we feed is what gets stronger, right? And that is our mind, right? And that is, so let's pause with that thought because we're hitting that thought really hard. But now let's talk about that in terms of being an encourager, right? As the person doing the encouraging. Yeah, stay with me today. I'm obviously babbling my words through. But as the person doing the encouraging, what about this lesson matters? Okay.
Maybe that it starts with us, that we can't be a good encourager if we haven't been encouraged in the past, or we're not spreading what we know.
Yeah, I think Kay said if we have to kind of spread what we know if we haven't been encouraged by something. It's kind of hard to deliver that encouragement. And I think you're absolutely on the right track. Derek.
So similar to the example, kind of parallels the garbage in, garbage out from an encourager standpoint. If you're practicing this positive aspect of life and going around encouraging, that will be encouragement back to you, and which would be, gives you that fuel to continue to do that.
Yeah, Derek said, being an encourager, you get that back. It fuels what you're doing, right? So there is an element of feeding that encouraging spirit that you have so that it's positive. Here's the other thing, and we talked about this some last week, which is just sincerity, right? If you're not really feeling it, then sometimes advice you offer is going to ring a little flat, right? It's not going to feel true, right? And that's why we have to be careful about cliches, because cliches are cliches because they're true. That's the first thing, right? But we can't just throw them out like, well, all things work together for those who love God. Guess what? That's a scripture. Absolutely true. There's context around that, right? There is meaning behind that. And it's not just something that you throw out and say, well, you're having a hard time, but all things work together. Well, not necessarily. If you're having a hard time because you're doing something that is wrong, that's probably not going to work out well, right? So we can't just toss out an encouraging phrase. We have to know more about the context. And this is last week when we talked about actually seeing the person, actually listening to the person that is having the struggle and kind of getting into a little bit of it. It gets a little messy, right? But, that might be the wrong cliche, right? I mean, that might be the wrong thing to tell this person. Oh, well, I can just keep doing this. It'll all work out, because I love God and it'll be fine. Maybe not, right? So when we talk about this, right, there's a piece of this as an encourager that has to come from a sincere place. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
I was going to say that to be an encourager, you also have to have courage.
Absolutely. And great point. Melissa said that to be an encourager, you have to have courage. You have to speak up when it would be very easy to just kind of let it go, right? And that is absolutely, it's an essential characteristic, right? So when we talk about having your mind prepared as an encourager, not only do you want to have these things, you want to be battling what comes into your heart, you want to be filtering those thoughts, you want to not allow garbage in, right? But you also then have to kind of summon that power that says, you know what, God's going to help me on this, I am going to step out there and do something. Sir?
The whole point of the mind of the encourager to me is, there's one aspect that I don't know that we've touched on a whole lot, is you have to walk the walk. There's a lot of things, if I'm doing things that are wrong, and people see me doing things that are wrong, and then I go to you and I say, Doug, you got this, you're good, it falls flat. You know, that doesn't mean you have to be perfect, but the whole, let your light shine, they have to see the benefits of doing the right things in you in order for them to even accept the encouragement you're giving.
Yeah, Mike says you got to walk the walk, right, as an encourager, right? If you're not living, this example, this light that Christ is, and you're not drawing out that strength and that the benefits that come from living your life that way, it falls flat, right? And so when we talk about sincerity, right, it's easy to say, well, I really mean it when I say it, but, okay, do I really live it, And that's the same thing when we talk about, how we live our lives. Yes, sir.
We have to invest time in getting to know our brothers and sisters. We have to know what their needs are. We have to know their strengths and their weaknesses, and focus on those weaknesses and try to build them up in those weaknesses.
Yeah, we're talking about investing time, right? Getting to know what is at the heart of this, what is this person about, what are their strengths and weaknesses, and trying to work with them. And I'll say that is 100% true in the macro, right? That you and I would have to get to, for me to really understand you, we got to spend some time, right? Now, it may not be quite as much time for me to still be of an encouraging benefit to you in a moment, but for me to be an ongoing encouragement and for us to build a bond where we're really developing them, that has to be the follow-up, right? It can't just be an encouraging moment and then we don't talk for the next, year until there's another encouraging moment, right? Because I don't want you to have to get into that second one, right? So I'm putting myself out there to build a relationship. And this is true, I think, I'm sorry, did you have a thought or?
Yeah. If you think about it, the book kind of recommends practice being an encourager. Okay. Right here at Jackson High, this is a safe place to start practicing that. Encourage people as they come in the building or in the class or if they're going through problems. We can practice here. It's a safe place. And then we can work on the things we get outside. The second thing is the Barnabas group meets tonight after services, and you can start being an encourager at 5 o'clock this afternoon.
Okay, so hold me on both of these. One is, Charlie makes the point that, this is a safe place, right? We can be an encouragement to each other, and we can work on that, and we can, hopefully we're all forgiving souls here, right? So if somebody doesn't do it quite right, we're going to cut them some slack, but at the same time, we are working on building those skills. We talked last week about, there's a bunch of kids going to come down the hallway in about 10 minutes, right? Say something good to them, right? Be positive, be uplifting, be encouraging, right? Those are, and to one another, right? People on this side of the room, go see these people. And, people in the middle, go out that way. But, let's talk to each other. Let's be encouraging to one another. Let's work on that. And then the second thing that Charlie points out is that we have an actual encouragement group called the Barnabas group that is meeting today at 5 o'clock. Actually, 6, because we meet for worship at 5, right? So at 6, right after services, that group meets in what used to be room 10, I can't remember what we call it now, down the hall, right? Follow the crowd. But if you want to, you say, hey, I want to start putting that in more concrete practice and not just in an individual effort, there's an opportunity there as well. I really like this discussion, and I will tell you that, and people who have taught before know this, I think, well, right? But this idea of walk the walk, it's not just about being an encourager, it's about being a Christian, right? Got to walk the walk. If I'm going to teach, and I'm going to tell you guys, we're going to work on being encouragers, and then I do nothing with it, you think I'm going to be very effective telling you guys to go do that? Probably not, right? I have to take the same lessons that I'm, presenting up here. I'm not really teaching. I'm, facilitating the discussion, but I have to take the same lessons. I have to suffer some of the same setbacks, and get better for this to be meaningful. So we want to put all of that together in that discussion. Okay. Romans 12:2 says, and I want to read this because this is another verse that we just kind of reference and run along, right? Romans 12:2 says, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed. Okay, that sounds very familiar, right? We usually stop there. Transformed how? By the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. How do I transform? By renewing my mind, right? By weeding the garden, right? By getting the garbage out, and when you see you've missed some, get some more out, and work on what's coming in and try to choke out the garbage, right? Those are the ways that I transform, because my mind drives everything else that I do. Let's see, what else? Okay, Galatians 6, 7, and 8, just, this is the principle that we've been hammering all class, right? What you sow is what you reap. Garbage in, garbage out, right? And that is true whether we're talking about gardening, whether we're talking about, transforming your character, whether we're talking about, the connection between your mind and your body. Positive, uplifting, things have an effect on how you have an outlook, how you react to circumstances, all of those things, and to your physical body, right? So somebody that's just constantly, well, I just can't get well, probably won't, right? So we have to fight those negative influences, because this is a principle that we know is true. What you sow is what you reap. And there's so many places where this gets talked about, right? You don't get fruit trees from sowing crabgrass, right? It just doesn't work. Those things are not the same. Yeah, Tyler.
I love that line of sowing and reaping. Over the last 2-3 years, I've been busy planting some trees on our farm. And anyway, this past summer, the heat of summer, me and Rick had to go move a tree from a location for a particular reason, and you sit there and think to yourself that, this tree, it has an uphill battle, and you have to flat out uproot it and move to a new thing in the hottest summer, right? But of course, we've tended to it and everything, and it's doing well. And my
Yeah, Tyler gives an example of planting trees, and sometimes you have to take some fairly radical action, like move a tree in the middle of summer, and you have to tend to it. You have to make sure that, you're doing everything you can to ensure that that change that you've made is successful. And I actually want to take it a little further, to take Tyler's example and think about it from the standpoint of, if you've been sowing in the wrong neighborhood, so to speak, you may need to change your neighborhood, right? You may need to not hang around with certain people that you were hanging around with, and say, I'm going to go be planted over here. Well, that's a big change, right? That's a very big change, and that needs to be tended to, right? It needs support. It needs encouragement. It needs all of the things that, probably in stronger measure, right? So when we tell somebody that we would say kind of comes out of the world and then comes into Christ, they're being transplanted, right? They're making a change that has to be tended to, not just by them, but by all of us, in order for that transplant to be successful, right? And that is a key part of the whole encouragement, that goes on. And kind of to Tyler's point, right? He's optimistic, right? We have to be optimistic that encouragement will bear the right fruit. Thoughts about that? The last one up there is rejoice always. And it's talking about celebrating things in the Lord. And I think, we don't always do as much of this as we could, right? And I think we would see the benefit if we celebrated and rejoiced in the good things that are going on with the Lord more, right? Not just when someone, becomes a Christian or is restored, because we do rejoice for those things, and I think we do that well. But, do we rejoice that we were, at least as far as I know, nobody in here lost their house this week, right? Let's rejoice in the Lord. He was good to me this week. I was not part of what could have been, or I had the opportunity to help somebody who did lose in that. I'll rejoice in that. I'll feel terrible for the person that lost it, but I'll rejoice that I had the means to try to help that person, right? So those are things that we put in our mind too, right? What kind of things do we celebrate? What kind of things do we rejoice in? So all of those things come together to kind of get our minds straight, because, as we're going to talk about in the next couple of weeks, right, there's the attitude of an encourager, but then there is the battle against discouragement, right? And those things are going to come together, and we're going to have to fight them in all these different ways. All right, so a couple of quotes that I pulled from here that I think are good, right? And we've talked about this a little bit, right? It says, an encourager has the spiritual maturity to see circumstances as an opportunity to learn and grow. And I wanted to look at James chapter 1. James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4. Now, I realize that this is talking about a broader spiritual issue, but I think the application is still relevant here. He says, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. What James is saying here is, you know what? Trials and temptations are going to come. And sometimes we're going to miss it. Sounds like what we talked about at the beginning of this class. Sometimes we're not going to get it right. But this is an opportunity for us to grow and develop and get better and build patience, so that we don't just get frustrated and go, oh, I'm done. I can't do this. So we have to be able to fight it forward. Don't leave. We got homework. Homework for the week. And if you're a home worker, reach out to another home worker, right? If you're somebody that works out of the house, reach out to somebody else like that. But encourage a co-worker this week. Lighten somebody's load. That is your homework for the week. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you next week.